Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our afternoon program. And we will have three very interesting sessions, starting with one on science policy practice and how to strengthen this interface among scientists and practitioners and policymakers. I will keep it very short because we have an excellent moderator, Anita. She is going to take over and enjoy the session. Anita, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us at this session on strengthening the science policy practice interface. I actually think we should win the award for the most difficult session title to pronounce. So as we begin this session, it's useful to reflect on the reason the summit organizers decided to devote an entire session to this topic. Over the past 2 days, we've been focused on actions to build capacity to better govern and manage groundwater in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, as we've heard from many of our speakers, key to the effective design and implementation of this agenda is the production of knowledge and integration of it into both policy and practice. Yet there are many barriers to both the production of knowledge and the use of knowledge and information in policy and practice. There are also times during which decisions must be made in the absence of knowledge. How do I make this work? There we go. Great. So several factors complicate the production of knowledge as well as policy formulation and implementation in relation to groundwater. The first are the physical properties of groundwater systems themselves. Groundwater flows underground within pores and throughout the fractures in rocks. These flows are slow, nonlinear, and hidden, and thus the effects of pumping and of recharge may take time, ranging from days to years to sometimes decades, to be observed. Groundwater aquifers also extend across large geographic expanses, thus the effects of groundwater depletion can be widespread. Lastly, due to annual and seasonal variation in weather conditions, multiple observations are needed over extended periods of time to understand and identify trends and to understand and evaluate the effects of groundwater use. So in sum, while some aspects of groundwater, the physical aspects of a groundwater system are easily observed and understood, others require extensive expertise and substantial data and analysis. But that's not all. There are several aspects of the social dynamics of groundwater systems that also influence the science policy interface. First is that groundwater is widely used by many stakeholders who may have conflicting demands. Policymakers are thus under pressure to balance across competing interests. Second, groundwater is often described using probabilities and error bars, but policymakers are risk adverse and seek certainty. This is because if a policy is based on expected outcomes and a low probability event occurs, both the policymaker and the policy will face substantial public criticism and resistance. Lastly, acceptance of policies is closely tied to social perceptions of credibility and legitimacy in policymaking. Yet due to the complexity of groundwater flows, the public may not have full understandings of the science and thus may not trust the policies. So in sum, the characteristics of groundwater systems exacerbate common reasons for disagreement and inaction in policymaking. Given this situation, our session today focuses on how to strengthen the science policy practice interface. We'll begin with a short intervention by Mr. Zhang Zhu, Chief Engineer from the Ministry of Water Resources, China. After that, the next portion of our session addresses the initial stages of policymaking, namely policy agenda, or making the decision to take action, and policy formulation, which means evaluation of which policies and practices to adopt and use. Mr. Stefan Siepmann, the communications specialist at the International Groundwater Resources Association Assessment Center, will introduce the Groundwater Catalog, a tool that provides detailed information on groundwater challenges and potential policy and management solutions. Next, Dr. Alyssa Dousman, Senior Vice President and Chief Scientist at the Water Institute, will present an example from the groundwater catalog demonstrating the value and content of this reference. Third, Dr. Yumiko Yasuda, Senior Network and Transboundary Cooperation Specialist at the Global Water Partnership, will present the partnership's toolbox, a virtual hub for knowledge sharing and expertise on water, science, and policy making. The second half of our session is then devoted to diving into the challenges policymakers, practitioners, scientists, and others might encounter as they seek to evaluate groundwater resources and to select and implement policies to manage groundwater. Here we will turn to a question and answer panel with 4 renowned experts. Each panelist will be asked about a different yet common challenge associated with the groundwater science policy practice interface and asked to provide their guidance and recommendations about how to navigate this challenge. Our esteemed panelists include Ms. Ione Butawa-Uka from the Malawi Government Department of Water Resources, Mr. Tom Su from the International Association for Hydro-Environmental Engineering and Research, Dr. Cesar Cremona from the European Commission and the DJ Joint Research Center, and Dr. Aditi Mukherjee will be joining us online from the International Water Management Institute. We'll then wrap up our session with a reflection on the panel conversation, as well as suggestions as how you can take the key messages with you today after the Senate, and therefore help to promote and strengthen the science policy interface. So with no further more ado, we'll get started with our opening address from Mr. Zhang Zhu.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. It is my great honor to attend the on behalf of the Ministry of Water Resources of the People's Republic of China. I would like to extend our warm congratulations on the convening of the session and our sincere greetings to all the experts and friends present here. China is the world's most populous country. Its water resources, however, only account for 6% of the global total. Groundwater, which takes up 1/3 of China's water resources, plays important roles in supplying water for production and daily life, maintaining ecological safety and food security, and ensuring strategic reserves in China, especially in North China. The Chinese government has always attached great importance to the management and protection of groundwater. In China, we practice the water governance concept of prioritizing water conservation, seeking spatial equilibrium, implementing systematic governance, and achieving government-market synergy. The protection and sustainable utilization of groundwater is incorporated into our important work agendas as both a major ecological project and a livelihood project. Among others, China has promulgated the regulations on groundwater management, the first of its kind in our country, and makes a series of key breakthroughs in this regard. Over the recent years, the groundwater managers and researchers in China have jointly committed themselves to combining groundwater management needs with scientific research. Because groundwater is invisible, untouchable, and almost beyond accurate measurement, we have exerted constant efforts to make groundwater management more digital, better network connected, and smarter, provided scientific and technological support for decision-making on groundwater management, and realized the in-depth integration of scientific research, technology, and management. First, we have carried out surface water groundwater coupling model research at the basin scale and introduced a technology for determination, adjustment, and control of key indicators such as reasonable groundwater exploitation volume and surface water utilization volume. These efforts help lay the foundation for distributing water at the basin level, controlling total groundwater withdrawal, and determining groundwater level control indicators. Second, we have reinforced technological research on areas such as water fertilizer integration and high-efficiency smart irrigation, supported the development of high-efficiency water-saving irrigation in North China and other key regions, and adjusted the agricultural planting structures. Third, more efforts are in place to enhance the simulation of groundwater digital flow fields and their circulation, and improve the governance of rivers and lakes, such as groundwater recharge. Fourth, the research related to the online groundwater level monitoring and early warning management systems that are based on the Internet of Things technology have enabled the building of a national groundwater monitoring project. On this basis, the changes of water levels in the prefectures and cities with groundwater overexploitation are announced, which serves as an effective warning and also motivates and encourages the concerned localities to control overexploitation. Fifth, our studies of policies and technical paths for optimizing the water withdrawal layouts in the groundwater overexploitation areas have facilitated the sustainable development and utilization of groundwater. Thanks to all these comprehensive control efforts over recent years, the groundwater levels in northern China that used to suffer severe groundwater exploitation have gone up in the overall sense. I thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you for your words, Mr. Zhang. I understand that you have somewhere to go, but we appreciate that you took your time to talk to us today and to have a conversation with our audience. Next, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Mr. Stefan Siepmann from IGRAC. You up there for the slides.
Before I start my presentation, I want to clarify something for the people who have looked at the program earlier this week and think Christina Fraser doesn't look anything like her profile picture on WUFA. Due to sad, unforeseen circumstances, she couldn't be here and I'm filling in for her. But everything I'm going to present couldn't have been reality without her hard work, so I want to have that said before starting. So, next slide. Thank you. This World Water Day was unique in its kind. For the first time were World Water Day and World Toilet Day aligned with the same theme, but also because this year we decided to not just have 2 days of celebration, but instead raise awareness about the role that groundwater plays within environmental and societal themes throughout the whole year. The Groundwater Summit obviously being the grand finale of that year, but we also wanted to have something tangible for the period beyond 2022. And that has become the Groundwater Catalog, which I'm presenting to you today. But what was the inspiration for that? Earlier this year, the World Water Development Report has been published by our friends of UNESCO WAP, in which they connected groundwater with themes like climate change, ecosystems, agriculture, industry, and human settlements. And that served as a great first stop of trustworthy source of information and knowledge to bridge the gap of groundwater knowledge. Meanwhile, the World Water Day campaign has definitely elevated the public perception of the importance of groundwater and has also strengthened the mandate to put it higher on the political agenda. However, unfortunately, information and awareness is not enough when engaging across the science policy practice interface. And that is why we needed something to show how science policy practice can be put into practice and give the water managers, decision makers, and practitioners the means to find the right measures to solve their groundwater problems. How did we do that? We have assigned resources to each of the 3 components of science policy practice, which in practice meant that we have selected a group of themes that have a relation to groundwater, a connection with groundwater. We have created a collection of measures, instruments, and tools that can help with groundwater governance and management. And finally, we also have a database with case studies in which we have practical information on how these measures have actually been implemented before. Hence, the decision makers, practitioners, and water managers going to the groundwater catalog will be presented with information, measures on solving the problems they may have, and already examples of how that has been done, including lessons learned and best practice. This is an old version of the slide. There we go. So, how would it look like in practice? If, let's say, I'm a decision maker and I'm ruling a country with a coastal line, then I would probably be interested in the coastal cities topic. So I would go to the topics, click on that one, and then I will be presented with very digestible information on the topic itself, alongside references and external links. When I scroll down, I would find potential measures that could be applicable to the problem I may have related to coastal aquifers. I select the one that's most relevant to me, and then again, I will get very digestible, concise information on the topic itself to learn more about that, but also below, information about case studies in which that measure has been implemented. In this case, a case study that I will select that will be further explained by the next speaker, Alyssa Doudsman. As you can see, there's a short description of the case study, there's a geographic area mentioned, but also lessons learned during the implementation, and also important boundary conditions to see if indeed this could be replicated in my own scenario, in my own situation. There was another slide with the user profile of Alyssa. Contributors have a user profile to give them credit for the work they have done for the groundwater catalog, but it will also be shown alongside the case study. Apart from giving them credit and recognition, it also helps decision makers to not only learn more about the measure that could be interesting for them, but to also find out who are the experts in that field. And vice versa for groundwater experts, it's a nice way to get on the radar of decision makers in dire need for their expertise. Having said that, today we have launched the final update of the groundwater catalog, and I would like to invite every groundwater expert in this room, but also the people watching online, to go to groundwatercatalog.org, after the session of course, and create an account, start submitting case studies, because by doing that, groundwater will not only be a theme of 2022, but we will continue to make the invisible visible also in the years to come. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So next I'd like to have Dr. Doudsman come up and talk to us about this example.
Thank you so much, Anita and Stefan. All right. Good morning. You have the slides? Awesome, thank you. All right, thank you. I am with the Water Institute, and I appreciate you inviting me to speak on this case study. It's already in the catalog. If we head over the Atlantic Ocean to the United States, you'll head to Louisiana. And in Louisiana, we have an area called the Capital Area Groundwater District. It has a population of about 650,000 people, and it's about 6,300 square kilometers. There's a confined aquifer there called the Southern Hills Aquifer System that supplies water for both drinking and industry, public supply and industry. In 2020, withdrawals were approximately 140 million gallons a day, with about 60% of that groundwater being used for public supply and 40% for industry. This aquifer was once an artesian aquifer that now has a cone of depression. So an artesian aquifer, if you were to poke into it, right, it would flow freely. And now it has a cone of depression where you have water levels that are now below land surface as great as negative 33 meters or so. So the aquifer system is a series of sands and confining units. And these sands and confining units in the aquifer system that supply, you can see the wells that come down, and they are threatened by saltwater intrusion that comes across the fault on the right. And so due to that cone of depression and the saltwater intrusion, you have a threat to that aquifer system. So The aquifer, as a result of these problems, the Capital Area Groundwater Conservation Commission was created in 1974. It has 18 commissioners, and it was developed to provide for efficient administration, conservation, and orderly development and supplementation of the groundwater resources. They are a range of representatives that manage this aquifer. But because of conflicts on the commission, they've had trouble managing and making decisions, and they do not have a long-term strategic plan for conservation. The Water Institute is an independent applied nonprofit research institute. And so they started working with the commission in 2019, utilizing structured decision-making to do long-term strategic planning. The work is to facilitate this commission to work through conflict in making decisions, develop policies, and putting those into practice based on sound science and data. Structured decision-making uses a formulation called PROACT, first defining the problem and the decision context with these decision makers. What decisions are they trying to make, understanding their legal authority and policy context, and taking into account the population and the economic growth. Next, in the PROACT cycle, we worked with the commissioners to define the fundamental objectives. What are they trying to achieve in the next 50 years? Noting that in structured decision-making, it's okay to incorporate values in competing objectives. So as long as it's an open and transparent process. So for this commission, they included sustainable groundwater withdrawals, water for both drinking and in industry, reducing saltwater intrusion, as well as acknowledging the risks related to subsidence. Next, the commission has identified feasible, cost-effective, and reasonable alternatives that can be used to achieve the objectives. Those alternatives are currently being discussed with the commissioners for evaluation. Then you go to models and science, which are being developed and used to forecast the consequences of various alternatives. For example, groundwater availability, but also the economic effects of these alternatives, looking at population growth and changing water demand over time. The next step in the PROACT cycle is what we call trade-offs and optimization, related to forecasting the consequences of the alternatives and the fundamental objectives. It not only includes science and data, but also legal and policy research. You can also incorporate uncertainty explicitly into thinking through the decision-making process. So after the trade-offs is provided to the commission, the last step in the cycle is for them to decide and take action. These actions are made in a public, transparent manner, informed by the work of the prior work related to the PROACT cycle. So structured decision-making using PROACT can help any community in the world work through challenging groundwater management problems in a productive manner based on science, data, values, the economy, legal and policy understanding. And I'd like to end with a quote with one of our commissioners, who is also a decision maker. Having been involved for nearly a decade now in regional groundwater management issues, I can unequivocally say that this is the way forward in answering the complex questions that we face. Thank you very much for having me. I encourage you all to go to the groundwater catalog and take a look at what we've provided, but also contribute.
Terrific. Thank you. Now we have Dr. Yasuda, who's going to present to us another tool for policymakers.
Thank you very much for this, and it was very interesting to see this groundwater catalog. Congratulations. I am introduced by our facilitator. I will be now introducing another toolbox, which is the IWRM Action Hub, the Integrated Water Resources Management Action Hub, which is the GWP's new toolbox that we have launched in March this year. So what it is a real global learning platform that we really try to emphasize this interconnectivity between the learning and exploring and connect. And during a preparation meeting, I was asked what is the difference between the groundwater catalog and this GWP's toolbox. Main difference is this GWP toolbox, the scope is more on the broader water issues, water sector, not necessarily focused on the groundwater. And it's a tool for integrated water resources management. But much of that tool can be applied to the management of the groundwater. So I would say it really complements to the groundwater catalog that is very much focused on the groundwater issues. The other aspect perhaps would be that this IWM Action Hub really has emphasis on interactivity. So I will explain you a little bit in my presentation what these are. So really there's a lot of different ways to engage with this toolbox through accessing and downloading the different tools and also to the resources from the different sections to exploring and sharing the cases and the lessons that you have learned and many, many other ways. So one of the really main function is this IWM tool. And I don't know how many of you have known about GWP's toolbox before. Okay, thank you very much. Maybe half of the people here have heard about this GWP toolbox, which we've already had this for the past, I think, about 15, 20 years. And this year, in March, we have actually launched the revised version of this IWRM toolbox. And as you may know, that IWM concept builds around 4 key concepts of enabling environment, institutional arrangement, management tools, and financing. And surrounding these tools, there are 86, there are 86 IWM tools that specifically talks about how you can actually implement this concept of integrated water resources management. The groundwater management plans is actually one of the tools that we are highlighting, but there's many more other tools in this toolbox. And then again, similarly to also the groundwater catalog, really we do have emphasize on the case studies. For each of the tools that we have, there are case studies of how that tool is applied. We have learned in the past years that people learn from other cases on how you actually implement the concept. And really the beautiful part here is that you can also submit your case study if you think that applies to the tools. One case study could also apply to different tools. So see in the screen, the red circle is where you can submit. And there's also a function to compare different case studies under the same tool. So these are different functionalities. There's also a large amount of resource libraries that are related to this toolbox and also linked to different tools. And the IWM curator, it also allows you to check where your status is in terms of IWM. If you want to achieve something, let's say if you want to achieve some work on the groundwater, you can also search from that. So those are the functionality of this toolbox. Now, another key functionality I mentioned related to this interactivity is this IWM Action Network. All the users of our toolbox, you can see them where they are located on these maps. And then you can also find who they are with the photos and expertise, and you can really, this is a really great way to know the global network and also experts in the field of IWM and on this water resources management. And another, related to this, one of the key tools that we have in this toolbox is to create a community. So the like-minded individuals, organizations can come together and say, well, to actually have an online space to interact and exchange on the different knowledge and tools and so on. And I'm very, very happy to announce today that we are launching this groundwater family as a community of the groundwater that we actually developed together with UNESCO. There was a very strong interest from the organizer of this summit to say, we are actually gathering all these people, and this is the first summit on this topic on the groundwater. And since 2 days ago, there has been so much very deep conversation, very interesting conversation, and we didn't want to stop at this conference. I mean, we wanted to, together with UNESCO was really telling us like we want to really continue this conversation beyond the summit. So now there is this groundwater family. You can access this community, and you can see the QR code. And if you are during the coffee break, if you go outside, you can see posters on the wall, on the sign box, so you can scan the QR. There's also announcement in the Hoover platform for those who are using the Hoover platform. In every chat topics, there is actually, this is pinned. So please,
Thank you.
please go to this community, and we really look forward to exchanging on this platform. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you for that useful tool. We're now going to turn to our panel discussion, where we'll discuss some of the common challenges that are encountered during the science policy practice interface. I'll begin with a question from Ms. Butao Uga. In many areas of the world, data on or knowledge of the groundwater system is lacking or incomplete. What steps can be taken to develop and implement policy when there is limited knowledge?
Okay. Thank you so much for that question. Indeed, data and or knowledge of some aquifers is missing in many countries in the world. But there are methods and tools, there are several actually, methods and tools that we can use in order to come up with the knowledge, or to get the knowledge that we want concerning our aquifers. For example, if we want to understand the system processes, we can use analytical as well as numerical or statistical approaches to get the knowledge. We can use models to estimate the recharge, for example, as well as to quantify groundwater, as we did in Malawi some time back when we were developing our master plan for the water resources. We used the Mike Shea and Mike Basin models for DHI. There was also mention of somebody in one of the sessions mentioned that they were able to use the Q95 for river flow to estimate base flow. Another approach that we can use is the use of isotope hydrology. This we have also used in Malawi. We used it, actually, we used carbon dating to come up to determine the age of groundwater and the source of some of our groundwater resources. But actually, we want to do more with this, like to determine the contribution of groundwater to surface water. So these are some of the methods or approaches that we can use. Not only this, we can also use online resources. We have just heard here actually of the groundwater catalog. There are so many online resources, portals that we can use as well, or tools that we can use. I'll mention of this one, maybe it has not been mentioned here. We have the SADC Groundwater Literature Archive. This one we can find a lot of scientific materials on our groundwater. There are about 4,000, reports of publications that have been put in there, books, journals, and so on. This is just one example, but there are so many of these tools. I think we can use online resources to get the geology, the hydrogeology of our aquifers that we want. We have also found out that the researchers, the academia, the NGOs, as well as the private sector. For example, me from government, I may be saying we don't have data, or I don't have the knowledge for a certain aquifer. But these, if you consult them actually, they do have, some of these, they do have a lot of data and knowledge, which is either not shared or even not publicized adequately. If you go to the mining companies, for example, they possess data or information on the deeper domains. It's including even the aquifers. And in the recent past, actually, we have been revising our policy. It's in the draft form. We consulted a lot of these organizations and so on, and we were actually amazed to see the data as well as some of the information that they have, which is just stuck out there. It's not being used. So we can actually get this data from this. So you need to be proactive and to consult, like to do a data rescue program. And now, when it comes to after you've developed the policy, now you're implementing the policy. Some of the things, the strategies that can be put related to data and knowledge is we need to enhance our hydrogeological capacity. That is, we need to develop in-depth knowledge of the relevant actors as well as the organizations. We have to train our hydrogeologists, but not only that, we need to give basic training as well as raise awareness to those people that we work with. For example, we work with planners who are economists, and these people are supposed to help us actually in formulating our policy strategies. They need to understand what we are talking about, because some of them, like in Malawi, they have been telling us that the language that we use in groundwater or in water resources in general, somebody mentioned actually managed aquifer recharge and said, it took me some 5 years to really understand what you mean with this. So we need to raise awareness so that these people, they also understand what we are talking about and they assist us. And not only that, we need to invest in the monitoring of our aquifers. We have to have monitoring wells. Even in the production wells, I think we need to monitor the flows. We need to have good information systems, and we need to have good software that is able to process as well as analyze our data. So we need to put that in our strategies, and we need to implement that.
Thank you.
And
I'm sorry, I know you have more to share, but we are out of time, and I need to move to the next question.
all right, okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Su, my question for you is almost the inverse of the one I just asked, which is namely, while in many instances there's a lack of knowledge on groundwater, in other instances we are making progress in developing knowledge on groundwater. How can we more quickly and more widely incorporate both advances in scientific understandings into groundwater policy and scientific innovations into groundwater practice?
Yes, thanks, Anita, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to give a few thoughts. Let me start by saying everybody agrees that groundwater is a critical resource, and indeed the Global Water Policy Report of 2021 showed that 88% of ministers and national water leaders all considered groundwater critical for the future of their water supply. But only 1 in every 4 of them found that groundwater was being sustainably managed in most areas of their country. And interestingly, the report found that of these same leaders, a quarter of them tell us that groundwater is not being managed sustainably anywhere, or they simply do not have enough information to know. So today I'd like to highlight a few action areas where I think the science policy practice space can be, where we can make some progress to confront this challenge. Firstly, IHR, the organisation I represent, has some 5,000 members, some of whom are here today, including our Vice President, Amparo Lopez, sitting in the front row. And we strongly put forward that not only assessment science, but solution science must work hand in hand with practice and policy to meet our challenges. So policymakers, they need to understand the challenges that they are facing, that are at hand, and they need a vision of the current situation. But they also need to understand what are their options for implementation, what are the trends that could shape the future solutions landscape. It's only in this way that the policy makers can have that holistic understanding of the actions that they take or that they don't take and the consequences of them. So I can make a small illustration by jumping out of the water sector completely into the climate and energy sector. So it's evidently important to understand the climate change science, the phenomenon that shape the climate that's coming in the coming decades. But if there was no science and engineering to help us understand the solutions available to us, the policymakers would not have what they have today in terms of renewable energy policy options. So in this same way for groundwater, both assessment science and solution science is important, especially given the uncertainties that's inherent, particularly in groundwater science. This includes what I call blue-green engineering and research that seeks holistic approaches bringing together the environment, economic and societal needs with solutions. Secondly, I'd like to highlight that improving access to data and information as well as adopting advances in modelling and probabilistic assessment methods, will help decision-making and provide options. Thirdly, I'd like to highlight that we must look at science, practice and policy in a cross-sectoral, system-wide manner. And the reason why I say this is because groundwater is a resource that is inherently connected beyond the water sector. So having frameworks that better align science, practice and policy with other sectors such as agriculture, such as land use, health and others is absolutely necessary if we're going to talk about sustainable groundwater use. And lastly, I'd like to highlight that, okay, science and practice helps understanding, provides option solutions for policymakers, right? But groundwater policy decisions often remain really quite difficult to make for our decision makers. They remain difficult. And that's due to all the different political balancing acts that they are required to undergo every day. So to address this, I'd like to introduce the concept and the idea of policy scaffolding, which builds upon science and practice options and innovations, many of which may be difficult to uptake on their own, despite all the toolboxes and things. So the idea of policy scaffolding is it's like very much like a scaffolding around a high-rise building, in the same way that scaffolding makes high-risk work, high-risk decisions easier to make. The water policy scaffolding can do this by providing policy options. I've been told I'm running out of time, so I'll just come straight to my last point, which only takes 10 seconds. So I'd just like to highlight the importance of carrying this to the 2023 conference. I'd like to highlight that we need to continue to listen to our water science leaders and policy leaders, and that includes the next water policy report coming up in 2023, as well as the IHA World Conference in Vienna, where we will be bringing science and policy leaders to discuss our options. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Carmona, related to the complexity of groundwater systems, scientists conducting studies and providing information on groundwater struggle to convey the depth of knowledge they have in a manner that can be understood by a wide audience. What guidance can you give us on how to convey the outcomes of scientific research in a manner that can be acted upon by both policymakers and practitioners?
Okay, thank you very much, Anita, for the question. So I will speak in French.
So, to answer this question, which is in fact not a simple question, I'd like to explain to you our point of view based on our experience in Africa when it comes to groundwater resources and water resources in general. So the Center for Research of the European Commission, with the excellence centers in Ouda, and in collaboration with the University of Pisa, and with the participation of stakeholders in the economic, in ECOWAS, in these various territories. Well, we conducted a study on aquifer systems in Africa, and we hope to publish the study very soon in a scientific journal. And among the various conclusions that we drew of the study is the fact that the knowledge, and this is something that we've spoken about extensively these past 2 days, the knowledge on the aquifer systems, on groundwater, are mainly to be found in the scientific networks and in universities. And very little of this knowledge is actually in the hands of experts and policymakers. And that's an important point, because that brings me to one part of the question that you asked of me, i.e., how can we share, I'm not talking about knowledge transfer, but how can we share this knowledge with the policymakers and all of the other people who work on the operational aspects in this field. So it's obvious that the groundwater catalog that was developed by IGRAC and all of the other tools that were developed by IGWP, all of these are important steps in this direction towards sharing knowledge. But what's important today is that we're developing currently something that we still need to strengthen this and further develop this, i.e. tools of management. So tools that enable us to go from knowledge from data to information that underpins decisions. So we need to work on these kinds of tools currently. So these are tools that will help identify the issues and to also identify priorities in these fields. It's also important, we spoke earlier about databases and catalogs, to include in these catalogs concrete issues with also concrete solutions. So you can give out a series of solutions for experts on the field so as to illustrate how to respond to real issues that they are confronted with on the field. For us, it's quite obvious that all of this must be supported by investment in governance so that we can integrate groundwater in water resource management. That's something that's really obvious to us. And here I'd like to talk about something that we haven't mentioned very often these past few days, i.e. capacity building at the level of policymakers, people who take decisions, so that institutionally speaking, even transboundarily speaking, people are able to speak the same language. I don't have much time, I'm afraid. So let me move directly to the conclusions. So it's fairly clear that we have developed tools and videos. We've also developed video games, in fact, which help you make electromagnetic measurements to characterize aquifers. It's very complex. So thanks to this video game that we developed, well, not us, the CCCA, but in Mexico, which is one of our centers of excellence in Latin America, we now have a network of electromagnetic measurements. And this is actually quite simple. And these are actually the first steps that will enable us to come up with interactive solutions. Because, in fact, water resources, surface water resources, are related to groundwater resources, and we need to treat them in an integral manner. Thank you.
Thank you for those words of wisdom. My last question is for Dr. Mukherjee, who is joining us online in the upper corner on our screen. My question for you relates to the role of groundwater users and those affected by groundwater use in the science policy practice interface. Beyond basic forums for participation, how can the values, knowledge, and activities of local stakeholders be incorporated into and used more effectively in decision-making?
Thank you, Anita, so much for having me in this exciting session. And I am really sorry that I couldn't be in person for reasons beyond my control. So a couple of things before I come to the question is, this has been such an exciting year for all of us who in the groundwater community. Not only the World Water Day was celebrated as also the Groundwater Day, but this year we also published the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, and actually both the working groups of the IPCC, the working group 1, which is on physical basis of climate change, and the working group 2, in which I was involved as a coordinating lead author in the water chapter. Both of these chapters actually have given quite a bit of like in-depth assessment of the groundwater. So I would request this. I'm sure many of you have read those reports, but those both have a lot of information around what's happening to groundwater vis-a-vis climate change observed, as well as for the projected ones. I'll encourage, if you haven't seen those, please have a look, because that's really basically all of you sitting in these meeting rooms and halls. I mean, it's your work that has been assessed by a group of us involved in those IPCC. Now coming back to your question, Anita, and I also found some of the earlier questions that you asked to the other panelists very, very relevant. I mean, so many of us, I work largely in South Asia, and while some countries like Bangladesh, for instance, has fantastic data. By the way, there was also a very nice article in Science earlier in September. Again, Science made groundwater this chief feature, which I wouldn't have thought possible. Yeah, I mean, but that was a very nice thing too. But I mean, coming back to the data and and people's knowledge, that kind of question. I mean, so many of us work in places where groundwater data is really scarce, and in those contexts, I have often seen that going for more unusual data that may not be perhaps as precise, but that's good enough for policy making. Some of the work that we have done at the International Water Management Institute and some of the work that our partners have done have actually been about use of community and local wisdom around groundwater. For example, we have these traditional well drillers, whose families have drilled wells for centuries, and they have amazing understanding of what an aquifer looks like. Just collecting those lithologs for them, collecting those layers of soil from them can give us a very nice kind of understanding of the aquifer. Similarly, we have also used more unconventional sources. I'm a social scientist by training, and I do a lot of surveys, just understanding from farmers, what kind of, like their understanding of the water tables also provides us that kind of information and data in the absence of more conventional one, like, drilling wells and all of those, which we absolutely need. I mean, there is no doubt that if there's a big investment that needed in groundwater, that's really about fine-tuning our observation systems in pretty much wherever that those kind of observation wells are not well enough. Coming to the other issue about how can those other forms of knowledge influence policy making, I mean, one of the things I have found most effective is often farmers know what is it that helps them access groundwater and what is it that's impeding their access to groundwater. And again, to give some example of the work that I have done in the past, my colleagues at IMI and other organizations have done in the past, is around understanding those indirect linkages to groundwater. So when we talk to farmers, it's rarely that if they're not using groundwater intensively for irrigation, it's rarely because the groundwater is not available. It's mostly because they tell us either there's something with the electricity tariff or something with the access issues, some governance rules, some permit rules that's preventing them from making use of groundwater. And that's even in water abundant parts of the world. So actually understanding what are those determinants that kind of prevents or actually makes it easier for farmers to use groundwater is a very powerful policy tool. And a lot of our work we have found, and I hope that many of you will agree, that many of the direct blunt instruments for groundwater governance, for example, things like laws, don't really work in a condition where it's very hard to implement laws. I mean, my country has 20 million groundwater wells, so who's going to monitor them? So indirectly, we have indirect instruments such as, electricity tariff, and we are increasingly now working on solar irrigation pumps where actually some of the things like feed-in tariffs. So we have found that energy is a very important, how do I say, lever of those kind of groundwater access. And we as groundwater professionals really have to think outside of the water box and go into those energy boxes and those food boxes to understand how local stakeholders are making use of groundwater. I hope that answers your question to some extent. Yeah, thank you, Anita, for this
Terrific.
opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. And thanks also. And thanks also to our other panelists and speakers for all of your insightful and invaluable comments. As our conversation here today has highlighted, the science policy practice interface for groundwater is multifaceted, fraught with challenges, and at the same time immensely important. Each of our speakers has contributed to understandings of different aspects of this interface. We learned about the IGRAC Groundwater Catalog and the Global Water Partnerships Toolbox, two resources available freely. And not only do these resources provide information, they also support development of communities of practice, namely enabling policymakers, managers, scientists, and citizens to interact and learn from one another. We then heard detailed recommendations from each of our panelists about actions to strengthen the science policy practice interface. I'd like to summarize a few of those main messages. First, most of our panelists echoed a comment we've heard several times at the summit regarding the need for training and capacity building. While there's definitely a need to train hydrogeologists and engineers within a country, equally important is to increase knowledge at both the policy level and the operational level. Our panelists also highlighted the importance of two-way communication between science and policy. We need to help scientists understand the complexities faced by decision makers so that they can produce information that is useful for decision makers. We also need to ensure policymakers and practitioners have knowledge of the role of groundwater, the options available for guiding groundwater use, and the potential consequences of both specific actions and of inaction. In addition, we were reminded that even when there seems to be a scarcity of information, there's likely knowledge that can be drawn upon. We should not hesitate to call upon knowledge and expertise of others, be that global resources such as the World Water Development Report and international exports, regional knowledge sources, including that of neighboring countries, and the very local knowledge of people using the water. In fact, this latter point is quite important, as those that are close to the resource and most affected by its use are those that are most aware of and able to evaluate the impacts of management strategies. Lastly, we were called upon to provide policymakers with a scaffolding of principles and objectives and insights to support them as they confront difficult decisions. The case study on structured decision-making provided an example of this and illustrated how agreeing to objectives and goals at the outset of a project can lead to decisions that are not only more effective and efficient, but also more widely accepted. Our short hour today is, of course, insufficient for fully addressing the science policy practice interface, and I am absolutely positive that our speakers had a lot more information that they'd like to share, and that many of you in this room also have your own knowledge that we could benefit from. We encourage you to continue to raise awareness, to discuss and to disseminate your ideas and experiences on navigating the science policy practice interface for groundwater, as globally all of us will benefit from the strengthening of it. Thank you.